Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the 68th edition of Water Talk organized by National Water Mission, Ministry of Jal Shakti, Government of India. This series is an initiative of the National Water Mission to provide a platform to enable meaningful discussion on water resource management and its related aspects. Before we begin with today's session, let us first watch a short video highlighting the role of National Water Mission and community participation in water conservation. Chirag, we can have the video.
जलम जल स्थान गतिम सर्वथा एवं रक्षणीयम जंतु नाम सुख जीवनम हेतु जलस्य रक्षणम नूनम भवतु। जल ईश्वर स्वरूप है, सौम्य, शालीन, जीवनदायक। प्रकृति का दिया ये जल रूपी वरदान पृथ्वीवासियों के लिए सिर्फ एक विरासत नहीं बल्कि एक जिम्मेदारी है जिसे आने वाली पीढ़ी के लिए संभालना आवश्यक है और इस उद्देश्य की ओर पूरी निष्ठा से कार्य कर रहा है जल शक्ति मंत्रालय, भारत सरकार।
जल के बिना जीवन संभव नहीं। हमारी प्राचीन परंपरा में भी पानी के महत्व का वर्णन प्राप्त होता है। यजुर्वेद में कहा गया है, आपो हिष्ठा मोयो भोवो, अर्थात इस धरती पर जीवन प्रदान करने वाला रस जल ही तो है। अनियोजित शहरीकरण ने तालाबों और झीलों जैसे जल संचय के परंपरागत तरीकों को लुप्त कर दिया है। हमारी आने वाली पीढ़ियों के लिए स्वस्थ और सुरक्षित जीवन के लिए करना जरूरी है।
जलवायु परिवर्तन के प्रभाव का विशेष ध्यान रखते हुए नेशनल एक्शन प्लान ऑन क्लाइमेट चेंज के तहत नेशनल वाटर मिशन की स्थापना की गई। राष्ट्रीय जल मिशन के प्रमुख उद्देश्य हैं जल का डेटाबेस सार्वजनिक रूप से प्रस्तुत रखना और जल संसाधनों पर जलवायु परिवर्तन के प्रभाव का आकलन करना, जल संरक्षण वृद्धि और संरक्षण के लिए नागरिक और राज्य कार्रवाई को बढ़ावा देना, शोषित क्षेत्रों सहित संवेदनशील क्षेत्रों पर ध्यान देना, 20% तक जल उपयोग कुशलता में वृद्धि करना और बेसिन स्तर के एकीकृत जल संसाधन प्रबंधन को बढ़ावा देना। जल संरक्षण हेतु 2019 में जल शक्ति अभियान की शुरुआत हुई।
जब किसी अभियान से जनता जुड़ी रहती है तो उसे कार्य की गंभीरता का पता चलता है, उसके सामर्थ्य का पता चलता है, उसके स्केल का पता चलता है, संसाधन कितने लगते हैं उसका पता चलता है। इससे जनता में एक सेंस ऑफ ओनरशिप आती है और जो सेंस ऑफ ओनरशिप जो है ना, वो सफलता की सबसे बड़ी पूंजी होती है।
2021-22 में जल शक्ति अभियान कैच द रेन नामक एक खास कैंपेन शुरू किया गया। जल उपलब्धता सुनिश्चित करने हेतु प्रत्येक वर्ष एक मुख्य प्रसंग का अनुपालन किया जाता है। 2023 का मुख्य प्रसंग रहा पीने के पानी के सतत स्रोत, जिसका उद्घाटन भारत की राष्ट्रपति महामहिम श्रीमती द्रौपदी मुर्मू द्वारा किया गया और 2024 में जल शक्ति से नारी शक्ति इस सिद्धांत को प्रबल किया गया। राष्ट्रीय जल मिशन का मोटो है रिस्पेक्ट वाटर फॉर लाइफ, जिसकी ओर बढ़ते हुए जल प्रयोग क्षमता बढ़ाने के लिए जल शक्ति मंत्रालय द्वारा पूर्णतः समर्पित प्रभाग भी शुरू किया गया है, ब्यूरो ऑफ वाटर यूज एफिशिएंसी। ये ब्यूरो कृषि, उद्योग और घरेलू क्षेत्रों में जल उपयोग दक्षता को बढ़ावा देता है, जिसके तहत विभिन्न हितधारकों से जुड़ना अनिवार्य है ताकि कार्यान्वयन हेतु मानक विकसित किए जाएं, जल लेखा परीक्षा को सुगम बनाया जाए, जल पद चिन्हों की पहचान हो, सामुदायिक जुड़ाव को सुविधाजनक बनाया जाए, अनुसंधान को प्रोत्साहित किया जाए एवं राष्ट्रीय और अंतर्राष्ट्रीय स्तर पर वाटर यूज एफिशिएंसी में सर्वोत्तम प्रथाओं को प्रदर्शित किया जाए। राष्ट्रीय जल मिशन द्वारा एक महत्वपूर्ण पहल की गई है। राज्य विशिष्ट कार्य योजना यानी स्टेट स्पेसिफिक एक्शन प्लान, जिसका उद्देश्य है जल संरक्षण, अपव्यय को न्यूनतम करना और राज्यों के भीतर तथा उनके बीच जल के अधिक समान वितरण को सुनिश्चित करना। एकीकृत जल संसाधन विकास और प्रबंधन के माध्यम से जल सुरक्षा, स्थिरता और समता प्राप्त करना है। इसके तहत जल की उपलब्धता, उपयोग और विकास से जुड़े वर्तमान एवं पुराने आंकड़ों का गहन विश्लेषण किया जाता है एवं मौजूदा जल नीतियों, योजनाओं और सर्वोत्तम प्रथाओं की समीक्षा कर जलवायु परिवर्तन के प्रभाव को समझने और उससे निपटने के लिए रणनीतिक योजना बनाई जाती है। स्टेट स्पेसिफिक एक्शन प्लान तैयार करने के लिए राज्यों एवं केंद्र शासित प्रदेशों को राष्ट्रीय जल मिशन द्वारा वित्तीय सहायता भी प्रदान की जाती है। प्रमुख राज्यों को 50 लाख रुपए की धनराशि एवं छोटे राज्यों एवं केंद्र शासित प्रदेशों को 30 लाख रुपए की धनराशि अनुदान के रूप में उपलब्ध कराई जाती है। SSAP सूत्रीकरण के समन्वय और निगरानी के लिए राष्ट्रीय जल मिशन द्वारा 2 नोडल एजेंसीज को नियुक्त किया गया है। नॉर्थ ईस्टर्न रीजनल इंस्टीट्यूट ऑफ वाटर एंड लैंड मैनेजमेंट, तेजपुर, असम, नेशनल इंस्टीट्यूट ऑफ हाइड्रोलॉजी, रुड़की, उत्तराखंड। इसके अलावा जल इतिहास नामक पोर्टल पर ट्रेडिशनल वाटर हेरिटेज स्ट्रक्चर्स की जानकारी सार्वजनिक रूप से प्रस्तुत की गई एवं जन भागीदारी को भी अत्यधिक प्रोत्साहित किया गया है। इसी कड़ी में एक विशेष पहल की गई है, जल संचय जन भागीदारी, जिसके अंतर्गत गांव का पानी गांव में और घर का पानी घर में इस उद्देश्य की ओर तीव्रता से कार्य हो रहा है। बोरवेल संरचनाओं पर विशेष ध्यान देते हुए आने वाले मॉनसून से पूर्व 10 लाख लो कॉस्ट आर्टिफिशियल रिचार्ज स्ट्रक्चर्स निर्मित करने का लक्ष्य निर्धारित किया गया है, जिसका उद्घाटन 6 सितंबर 2024 को सूरत, गुजरात से किया गया।
माननीय प्रधानमंत्री श्री नरेंद्र मोदी जी के दूरदर्शी नेतृत्व में 2019 में जल शक्ति मंत्रालय का गठन किया गया। प्रधानमंत्री जी ने जल को राष्ट्रीय प्राथमिकता बताते हुए जल संरक्षण को जन आंदोलन में बदलने की अपील की है। उनके मार्गदर्शन में जल शक्ति अभियान, कैच द रेन और जल संचय जन भागीदारी को जन आंदोलन में परिवर्तित करते हुए पूरे देश ने देखा है। अभूतपूर्व कार्यक्रम चलाए गए। इन प्रयासों से भूजल का स्तर बढ़ रहा है, जल संरक्षण को बल मिल रहा है और स्थानीय समुदायों को सामाजिक और आर्थिक लाभ प्राप्त हुए हैं। प्रधानमंत्री जी का सपना है कि भारत एक ऐसा जल समृद्ध राष्ट्र बने जहां जलवायु परिवर्तन के प्रभावों का डटकर सामना किया जाए और जल संरक्षण हर नागरिक का स्वभाव बन जाए। आइए माननीय प्रधानमंत्री जी के इस विजन को साकार करने में योगदान दें और जल संरक्षण को अपनी जिम्मेदारी बनाएं।
मंत्रालय के इतिहास में पहली बार राष्ट्रीय जल मिशन द्वारा भोपाल में प्रथम अखिल भारतीय राज्य मंत्रियों का सम्मेलन आयोजित किया गया और स्वयं माननीय प्रधानमंत्री महोदय ने इस द्विदिवसीय सम्मेलन को संबोधित कर इसका उद्घाटन किया।
Water security is critical for India to achieve our vision of Viksit Bharat. Water scarcity affects agriculture, industry and our daily lives, with the greatest impact on the poor and the vulnerable, women and children. Addressing this crisis requires a multi-pronged approach. Government, businesses and individuals all have to play their part. This is a collective responsibility. We need to be mindful of our water consumption, adopt water-saving practices like rainwater harvesting, and contribute to a sustainable water future.
जल शक्ति अभियान के अंतर्गत लाखों की तादाद में रेन वाटर हार्वेस्टिंग स्ट्रक्चर्स बनाए गए, अनेक जल निकायों का पुनर्विकास किया गया, विभिन्न जिलों में जल शक्ति केंद्र स्थापित किए गए, हजारों ट्रेनी प्रोग्राम्स और किसान मेले लगाए गए, वाटर बॉडीज की जियो टैगिंग और GIS मैपिंग की गई, और जिला स्तर पर साइंटिफिक डिस्ट्रिक्ट वाटर प्लान भी अपनाए गए। आइए हम भी जल शक्ति अभियान से जुड़ें और जल आंदोलन को जन आंदोलन बनाकर जल संकल्प को दृढ़ करें, क्योंकि संरक्षित हो जल तभी बेहतर कल।
I think that was a very comprehensive video on the initiatives taken by Ministry of Jal Shakti in water conservation and water resource management, and a very important message that comes out of this video is that community participation and grassroots action is the way to go ahead for sustainable water management in the long term. So we can begin with the session then. It is my privilege to have Shiv Mohan Dikshit sir from Ministry of Jal Shakti. Welcome, sir. And it is also my honor to welcome Dr. Jayshree Vencatesan, co-founder of the Chennai-based Care Earth Trust. Thank you for being here with us today, ma'am. It
My
is our
pleasure.
privilege to have you here. I
Pleasure.
would like to tell my audience that Jayshree ma'am is an environmental conservationist and she has dedicated 2 decades for environmental conservation, emerging as a leading voice in wetland restoration and conservation. In 2024, she became the first Indian to receive the Ramsar Award for wise use of wetlands, a global recognition presented by the Ramsar Convention Secretariat. And today she is with us to tell us about the critical role of wetlands that they play in sustainable ecosystem management as well as water resource management. As we all know that wetlands are a very vital resource for water conservation and water retention. And here we have Jayshree ma'am to tell us how Care Earth Trust and she leading the Care Earth Trust, how are they fostering sustainable wetland management and how wetlands can be used wisely for ecosystem management. Very warm welcome, ma'am, again. And
Thank you.
over to you for the presentation whenever
Thank
you
you.
say we, yeah.
Yeah, may I have the slides, please?
Yes, sure. We can have the
Namaste,
presentation.
Vanakkam, good morning. I would like to straight away get into the presentation, and essentially I will be talking about the wise use of wetlands. My name is Jayshree Vencatesan, as it has been mentioned already, and it's surely for certain a privilege to be here to share my thoughts with you. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Yeah, I am part of this very small organization called Care Earth Trust. Not many people know about us, and that's an advantage because we go about doing our work in a very quiet manner. It's a not for profit research and conservation organization. We are a group of scientists, actually. All of us have some connect with the Indian Institute of Science, and that's where most of us graduated from. And the mission is very clear. It's biodiversity, people, and conservation. And this is our 25th year, and so I'm so happy that I got a chance to participate in this event. And we've been awarded the Indira Gandhi Paryavaran Puraskar earlier for our work on wetlands, for saving a marsh in Chennai, and also for restoring the population of black buck in IIT Madras. We are an accredited organization of the UNEP and the Dutch program called Water is Leverage. The next slide. Yeah, without wasting much time, let's straight get into the technical part of the presentation. And some of this may sound rather fundamental to you, and you may wonder why I'm doing that. I'm doing that because very often we miss the very operative and key part in what we assume to be very well known, what does not require a kind of a repetition. That is the point that I'm trying to emphasize. So let's begin by understanding what are wetlands. The definition, as you can see, is very generic. This is the standard definition given by Ramsar Convention. Incidentally, the Ramsar Convention is the oldest of all the international conventions pertaining to natural resources. It was signed in 1977, and India was one of the earliest signatories of this convention. Wetlands include a wide variety of habitats such as marshes. Then it goes on saying peatlands, floodplains, rivers, lakes, almost anything that has a wet quality. That may also include wet soil. Technically, if there is a patch of land which has wet soil, that also qualifies as a wetland. And it should not be a deep entity. They don't include normally deep entities into this definition. And it can include both man-made as well as natural wetland. Most importantly, it also includes wastewater ponds. This is something not many of us realize. Those also come under the category of wetlands. It's a very, very generic kind of a definition. And most of the ecosystem services that the wetlands provide are intangible, indirect, invisible. So this is where the problem is in conserving wetland. Because it's given to each one of us to understand and interpret it the way we want to. Very often that's a problem when it comes to actually doing some action on ground. The next slide, please. Since everybody has been talking about wise use, what does the term mean? It's certainly not in the way we normally understood, being prudent. It's much more than that. Essentially, it says you should maintain the ecological character of the entity. This is what is called wise use. Maintaining, protecting, restoring, and conserving the ecological character of an aquatic system is wise use. So it's essentially science. And along with it, the implementation should be around ecosystem approaches, what we actually saw in the video. You should not mess around with aquatic habitats. That's the second takeaway. So one, it should adhere to the ecological character. Two, we should not mess around and stick to ecosystem approaches. The third slide, please. So what is ecological character? Because you said you should maintain ecological character. What then is ecological character? It's a combination of the ecosystem component, processes and benefits and services that characterize a wetland. Essentially the identity of a wetland. In very simple words, it means if it's a marsh, you handle it as a marsh. You don't mess it around and talk about it as a lake. Each one of us, we have a character. Likewise, these aquatic systems also have a character. First, we'll have to identify the character and make sure we protect that, recognize that, and treat it the way it ought to be treated. Next slide. So what exactly are these? The whole thing is about. The entire thing is about the ecosystem services the wetlands provide. Why is it important for us to look at this slide? It's important because if you can broadly divide ecosystem services provided by wetlands, they fall into this category of provisioning, cultural, regulatory, and support. It's not in this order actually, it's in a different order, technically defined. But humans prioritize it this way. Primarily because provisioning services is what we are aligned. Our drinking water, our agriculture water, water for all the uses, for everything that's human connected. The food we get, the food we grow, the food we hunt, the food we fish, everything falls under this category of provisioning services. That's why we accord a lot of importance to it. Next, the cultural part. As soon as it jumps to cultural part, we lose the monetized part of it. We don't no longer put a monetary value to it. We take it for granted. We all love going to the banks of the river. Watching the Ganga gives us great joy. But do we ever think how much of value that is actually in terms of monetary value? We don't. We take it for granted. We look at it as a vardhan. So the importance comes down a bit. But still it's river. So cultural and aesthetic values and all these get accomplished. The third is the regulatory thing. This is where now climate change is making a big difference. Until now, all those things that we took for granted, which we assume is nature's way of treating us, protecting us, is now coming back to hit us rather badly. Because most of the events, the extremities that we see, whether it be climate extremities, the disaster, are all a result of cumulative action of human abuse of nature over a long period. So it's here that we now realize that wetlands actually have been very silently protecting us. They've been protecting us against floods, against storm surges, you name it, any natural event, it's wetlands which actually do the protection. Because one thing that you would notice from the definition, wetlands exist everywhere, from coast to high altitude areas. So any place you live in, whether you live in the shores of Rameswaram or high up in the Himalayas, you have wetlands protecting you and doing it rather quietly. But this service of regulation has never been monetized, never been valued. So, but it's only now that we realize that this is something very critical, but the kind of recognition that it ought to get, it hasn't got. Finally, the support services. This is very important, and I'm very happy that the video actually highlighted this, because we tend to assume everything to be human-centric. That's a tendency that we as a species have. Supportive services is the kind of services that the wetlands provide to other living organisms. So that is something that we don't value at all. We push it right down. So this is how we handle ecosystem services when it comes to wetlands. Although in terms of economic value, in terms of carbon capture, they stand the highest. Next slide, please. So what did the Ramsar Secretariat do? They very smartly said, let's not call them services. Let's make it very precise. Tell people what wetlands are doing one by one in very absolute clear term. So it says it actually protects you from flood control. This goes so specific. Groundwater replenishment. And let me run through the list. It will tell you how critical wetlands are. Shoreline stabilization and storm protection, that's the coast. Sediment and nutrition retention and export, which is critical, the base for agriculture. Water purification, reservoirs of biodiversity, which is where you get all your fish and everything. Wetland products, this includes fodder, medicinal plants, some of our most charismatic medicinal plants like the Brahmi, they're all aquatic systems based. Then cultural values, of course, we know, recreation and tourism, and climate change mitigation. So this list has been made public so that people get to know what precise role wetlands play that is very relevant to humans as a society. It does not mean that the services stop with this. There are so many other services that the wetlands provide, but they are not of major consequence to humans. I mean, we're talking about the common man, so that's kept a bit down. It's kept so having said all this, we also are aware that world over, and especially in India, and especially in South India, there have been many projects made by the government, by the civil society, by research organizations, which speak about restoring wetlands. X number of wetlands have been restored and all that. Is there a guideline to monitor how restoration takes place? That's the next question. And there's a very simple kind of a framework that Ramsar Secretariat once again has put up. It says the first metric that you'll have to look into when you embark on a project of restoration is whether you've been able to maintain the wetland area. Essentially, have you been able to keep the area which retains, captures, percolates water intact? Have you improved water retention? Have you eliminated the risk that is there for the area to be converted to other landforms? Have you been able to get the species back? Because wetlands are one of the richest in terms of biodiversity. And then, do people, you heard Honorable Prime Minister referring to custodianship of projects. It's essentially that. Whether it has attained that kind of social valuation, do people feel that it's a system that they need to own up to? Do they feel connected to it? These are the things that they look into. And of course, you have to eliminate groundwater depletion. Very quietly and very drastically, one issue that has been derailing all the efforts that have been going towards wetland conservation is groundwater abstraction. Because despite having a hawk's eye on this in the government, there are many loopholes, many tankers, many illegal kind of transportation networks that operate in terms of groundwater abstraction and ferrying. Next slide. So what does this commitment of India to the Ramsar entail? It essentially says we work towards the wise use of wetlands and water resources through national plans, policies, and legislation. India was one of the earliest countries, first countries to come up with not only a charter, but a legal instrument and mission. I mean, everything that had to be done, India has already been doing it. And the wise use guidelines actually came into being in 1990. That's quite some time back, 35 years back. Not many countries have been up to it. India, of course, has a leadership role in this. It's been able to adopt wetland policies, but more importantly, India is one of the few countries which has been able to mainstream this across all sectors. That's something not many countries have even recognized as being very critical. India has done that, and we developed what are called the integrated management plans. The Ramsar Convention is essentially a very broad-based convention, but very importantly identifies areas, certain wetlands as wetlands of international importance, and India has already reached 89. And last 3 years have been phenomenal for the country. We've had many wetlands getting designated as Ramsar site. Tamil Nadu is leading the list with 15 wetlands, I think. And we had the privilege, Care Earth had the privilege of drafting the application for 11 of them. So that way, it's been a really great achievement for the country and for the state. So these Ramsar wetlands, every wetland has to have an integrated management plan. That is something that's being done. And the best thing about this plan is It takes into consideration not just the social part of it nor the economic part of it. It begins with the fundamental hydrology of the area and goes on to talk about things that are even, one would say visionary. 20 years hence, what would happen to the place? How would it be managed? That kind of very visionary kind of assessment is what is being done. And it's a very inclusive exercise. That's all. Next one. Next slide, please. So the contracting parties, when they say contracting parties, it essentially means governments and national governments are encouraged to develop, adopt, and use necessary and appropriate instruments to have an outcome-based approach. Because gone are those days when we would spend 20, 30 years doing things with no accountability. These days, everybody insists on an outcome-based approach. And decisions have to be made with awareness. This is actually a repeat of what's said across all conventions. That people have to be aware of what is being done and enhance the potential of the ecosystem services. You would notice that this term ecosystem services gets not only repeated but emphasized at every point, primarily because wetlands are essentially about ecosystem services. It talks about the most important but very often neglected invasive species management. A big problem to wetland management is actually the invasive alien species. And the other day I read an interesting article which said that the majority of invasive alien species are aquatic in character. So that's a big problem. In India, at least in South India, we've had this major problem of African catfish virtually running amok, displacing almost all the native fish. Earlier it was the tilapia. We've also had records of piranha in Chennai. So this is the kind of mess that we are forced to deal with. Most of it need not be deliberate or intentional release. Sometimes it's also accidental release. The small irresponsible actions also can lead to very drastic results. For example, in Chennai, aquarium trade has been responsible for the introduction of many of these invasive species into our natural system. So this becomes a problem, and that's where things like participatory programs and stakeholder very important. People ought to know what they are actually experiencing and what would happen if left untended. That ignorance has to be removed. It's not something that should be taken very lightly. And when people talk about participation, it's not a question of bringing them to events or making them do maps. That's a very superficial kind of doing thing. They should be involved in the planning part of it, the actual action part of it, over a long period of time. So you essentially need to work with communities for long. When I was introduced, I was told that I spent 20 years. That's bare minimum. We need at least 30, 40 years to be in the field to at least understand the basics. So that's the kind of intensity with which we should do. And the private sector needs to be involved because they thrive on it. They use this. One of the biggest users of water as a natural resource, as an input material, is the private sector. So it has to be made sure that they are involved in it big time. But all of this, I think, the last line is actually mine. It's not the Ramsar Convention. It needs to be crafted on a science-based, data-driven approach. Science-based not because science is superior, science-based because it brings in a lot of logic, clarity, it's iterative, it can be tested, it's objective, and that is why we need to have this. Next slide. So the convention, the Ramsar Convention, is connected to every other convention that exists in this planet, on this planet. There are about 13 of them. India is that way a leader in being a party to all these conventions. In most cases, we are the first signatories. The Convention on Biological Diversity, at least. I know for a fact we are the leaders. We were the first to sign it. So wise use is actually connected to biodiversity conservation, climate change, food security, health, every aspect that is essential for human civilization to thrive. Wise use is a concept that actually can be mainstream into any of these things. Next slide, please. So what are the detrimental disruptive factors of wetland restoration and conservation? This is essentially a summation of my work over the last many years. You would not find very great things being said here, primarily because most of these things are rather easy to tackle, but they still persist. The first problem that we have when it comes to wetlands, conserving wetlands on ground, because Care Earth is an institution and I believe in practicing research, not just publishing and being done with it. We take up wetland restoration projects. What are the things that prevent us from doing a wise use based wetland restoration project. The first thing is a nomenclature, because nomenclature defines what it is, the ecological character. Very often it's not standardized across sectors and departments. Primarily because while one part of the system continues to use a traditional classification and traditional nomenclature, the other uses the colonial imposed nomenclature. Wetlands in most instances is referred to, we refer to paddy lands as wetlands. That's a remnant of the British categorization of our lands. In South India, at least in Tamil Nadu and Andhra, when somebody says it's a wetland, it means it will be a paddy growing area. So such basic things, when we don't have them sorted out, it becomes really difficult to work with all the departments concerned or all the entities that are concerned. At times we end up talking at cross purposes. The second thing, we don't really have a clear number of, the exact number of an idea of the exact number of wetlands that exist. We have a very definite idea of how many lakes, how many ponds, how many tanks. Structures that have a very clear boundary, which are very well defined, which have a purpose linked to them, like irrigation or fishing or fodder. Those are identified. But wetlands, you remember, the definition also includes those entities which are just wet, which are essentially no man's land in small patches. We have no idea of the number. We really don't know what they are all about. So the characterization is completely missing. Then the diversity of types, the number of the kinds of wetlands that we have. India, despite having this wonderful, glorious tradition of good research for the last 25, 30 years at least, there are still major data gaps when it comes to the kind of wetlands that we get to find in India. Let me give you an example. Until recently, it was believed that the southern Western Ghats, that is essentially Western Ghats in the states of Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and Karnataka, do not have any wetlands in the high altitude area. Lo and behold, 5-6 years ago, they were discovered. We've discovered very good patches of marshes, spring-based wetlands, and stuff like this. And some say even peat areas, peatlands. That has not been authenticated in the Western Ghats. That would be something of a surprise, no? Because Western Ghats is one of the most studied regions, landscapes of the country. Even there, you have this kind of major data. And then you have multiplicity of names. The same area being referred to, one, you don't have name at all, or two, you have multiple names. So there are times when this causes a lot of confusion because you really don't know what entity you are handling or dealing with. Next slide. So the point I'm trying to make here when I speak about the ancient Tamil classification is not so much to celebrate and say that only Tamil Nadu has this kind of a categorization. To just pinpoint that much wisdom seems to have existed in our history with our previous generations. Because if you look at the ancient Tamil classification, which is still in use, by the way, it is a thing that's very normally used in everyday's conversation, there are 47 types of wetland. The most important thing about this is the features that are used to designate a wetland as a particular type are very different from what we do. One, the depth is the most defining factor. The depth of the wetland is the first attribute that early Tamils used to classify wetland. Then the manner of organization, which is connected to what? Is it a cascading system? Is it organized as a complex? What is the connection? How was it being carved out? These are the second thing. The third thing is how the inlet and outlet have been placed. And of course, fourth is the source of water. Does it get water from the monsoon alone or does it get fed by the rivers? Then it's generalization based on homogenization. Something the ancient Tamils did not subscribe to. What has happened is exactly the opposite of what the ancient Tamils practiced. We define wetlands based on how it looks, not what it is. How it looks is what very often determines what it is called. And so there is a continuous non-recognition of some of the wetland types, especially mountain wetlands. Mountain wetlands are those wetlands which are found in mid-altitude areas, not very high, but mid-altitude, like places like the Nilgiri. They are very classical in terms of their organization, their characters and all that, but we still designate them as something. This bringing a whole lot of diversity under one category is something that we do. That's what I refer to as homogenization. The next thing that we do is everything that we define or describe about a wetland is from a very human-centric thing. If we think it's useful for irrigation, we designate it as an irrigation wetland. And the minute it ceases that function, or the minute that particular attribute is no longer useful, we think it's not enough worthy of protection. And this is what has caused much of the problem when it comes to wetland conservation. In Chennai, for example, there was a point of time when many of the wetlands which then were outside Chennai, the peri-urban areas, and the city expanded, they were all drawn into the city boundaries and they lost their service, or their service of providing irrigation was no longer relevant. So instead of finding an alternate, it was then decided that this will be converted into housing area. So there was a specific scheme that converted these areas into housing plot. So much of Chennai which gets flooded, it's actually erstwhile water bodies, wetlands that get flooded. It's not housing colonies that get flooded. So such rudimentary mistakes we all made in the past. There's no point in blaming each other. I think now it's time for us to recognize that these flaws have been there, these errors were made, and we now take corrective action. Next slide. So wetland inventorying is the next problem because that's mandatory under the Ramsar Convention, and it's also something that we basically do. Inventorying is not just writing down names, you describe them in detail. It's not institutionalized at all. And I'm very glad that the mission is now taking upon the responsibility of doing it at least for designated water bodies. But it needs to be done for systems, aquatic systems, it needs to be done for wetlands. Even those areas which do not qualify as water bodies, as ponds, tanks, lakes, need to be brought under the scheme. There is a lot of skewed participation. For example, in the CSR-driven projects, they are not regulated on the basis of wise use. In fact, the biggest potential, if you really look at it, for civil society to be engaged in water conservation, one, of course, the government makes sure that it's done very well. There's there to backstop you at every point of time. But in terms of financial support, CSR, corporate funding, is a big kind of an opportunity which is out there. But in the absence of guidelines or a monitoring system which really looks at what these projects are all about, are they discharging what they're meant to be doing? Is the mandate in conformity with what the government is actually promoting, with what the Ramsar Convention is expecting us to do? In the absence of it, it becomes a very chaotic kind of, that's the right word, chaotic kind of system. Because it is brought down to the fondness, to the pet idea of one or two people, and that gets promoted. And there's no monitoring. In the absence of monitoring, you really have nothing as a kind of a model to follow. For example, I will use the case studies of the sector that I am representing, the NGOs, and not get into anything else. See, NGOs, we claim we restore hundreds of wetlands. Yes, we do it with the best of intentions, with all our commitment, we do it. But then, do we have the bandwidth? Do we have the skill? Do we have the funds to sustain it? Very often we don't. For us, it's a question of case to case. That is why we work with communities and make sure that they take ownership. But is all of which we are claiming in the project reports actually happening on the ground? Somebody needs to test it out. Because just as you have good cases, you may also have a lot of bad cases which are derailing the whole thing. And this is something that's happening, especially on this aspect of displacement of local communities and their livelihoods. Very often, when your plans are not anchored in ground reality, especially when it comes to wetland conservation, the kind of stuff that you do under the plan of restoration actually displaces a lot of community. For instance, let me give you a case of something that we encountered in Chennai recently. This is beautiful wetland which was traditionally used for irrigation, but then that ceased to be of no use. Although some of the families stayed behind, most of them left the place, and the land was opened up for sale. It very soon became a very posh, nice neighborhood. The restoration plan that the local community came up with was something that was good for them, not for those remnant 10-15 families which have been living there all their life. I'm not saying you should now get back to a position where you're to a state where you're going to practice agriculture. I know that's not feasible. But you at least have to take their voices into consideration. The communities were forced to move from there because they were seen as encroachers. They were seen as being detrimental to the place. Their livelihoods were lost. And what was the livelihood that they were practicing? There are people who are collecting leaves to make garlands. It's as simple as that. All that they are doing is collecting the aquatic plants. The leaves are used as part of the garlands. That's not even a service you recognize, right? I think the minute we speak of ecosystem services, it's irrigation, fishing, and fodder. There are also these smaller services, and people get displaced. In many places, dhobis get displaced when there are wetland restoration projects because you see them using caustic soda, you see them using harsh detergent, brand them as being very polluting, and then get them out of the place. So we have to be inclusive is something that we all know. I mean, that's the first step that you're taught when you get into subjects that deal with community. But we don't take much care of that. That's something that we have to do. And then there is no guideline, no standard, no benchmark, no framework that tells you type specific restoration guideline. What works for a pond will not work for a tank. Likewise, what works for the Himalayas or North India will not work south of India because everything about each of these is very distinct and they've evolved over time. See, for a wetland to stabilize, it takes a minimum of 40 to 45 years. And you try to do corrective action in 6 months. How does it gel? It doesn't gel. So time and patience is something that you have to inculcate. But more than that, in the absence of guidelines, we really don't know what to do. And far worse, you end up doing things which should not be done. These are problems that we encounter when we actually get into the field as a civil society organization. And all of this has been documented in a book we did with IIT Madras titled Wetland Restoration or the cover page on the slide. Next. Then, of course, we don't have an adaptive management approach. This is something that even some of the protected areas don't practice. Your management approach is frozen in time. What is the merit about using an adaptive management approach? It is iterative. Very simply, that is the merit. You go back to it every now and then. It can be a 6-month tenure, or it can be an yearly basis, and then ensure that you are doing a kind of a due diligence to see whether you are on the right course or whether corrective action needs to be done. Essentially, whether you can tweak the plan a bit and make sure correction is made possible. That needs to be done. You can't have plans lasting for 5 years, 10 years, and then expect them to fulfill the obligation. Primarily because climate change has brought in a lot of uncertainty. For instance, the average rainfall that a place gets. We've been monitoring this precipitation data for the last 20-25 years by looking at historical data. When the Chennai floods first gained importance, we looked at it, this was in 2005. We looked at 200-year-old data, and then it was very clear that until then, the rainfall, while it remained more or less consistent, 1,248, there was not much deviation. What was happening post 2002 was we were getting these extreme rainfall events. Chennai now has this pattern of extreme rainfall events, which is very erratic. The only thing that you can tell with certainty is very uncertain. This uncertainty is something that you have to factor in, and for which you need to have management plans which accommodate change, which accommodate some kind of tweaking in between. That is why we are suggesting that we should have an adaptive management approach. Then the biases and stereotypes that typify research and the eligibility criteria for doing research needs to be given up. This is a pet peeve of mine and has nothing to do with care. I say this because primarily we seem to assume that wetland research is something that can be done only by a particular category of institutions who practice this particular discipline. But in reality, you need to have more research coming in from disciplines that fall under the category of social science. That's where we don't have a good understanding of how wetlands need to be restored. Anything about wetlands from a social science perspective is missing. We need to put some thought there and we need to prioritize that as a research. The second thing where we don't have a good understanding is the ecosystem services, the valuation pattern. We all talk about contingent valuation as being the method for valuing wetlands, but have very little data to backstop whatever we are saying. Likewise, we don't have the kind of understanding of how many of our wetlands have actually lost their ecological character. You would find this very typically being said when we actually do some intense field work in what are designated as remote areas. People will tell you This particular wetland, I mean, when you're talking to the local communities, they'll tell you, when I was young, this used to look like this, or this used to be used for this. But now everything has changed. Badal gaya. In Tamil, they say marikos. So that essentially means that the system has changed. Why has it changed? What has it changed to? Does the system, do wetlands really change? These are things that not much understanding is there. We need to focus on it. Because one of the problems that we have in restoring wetland is the kind of difficulty that's associated. I'm not making comparison, but it's relatively easy to recover, restore terrestrial bed as compared to wetlands. Because they're shallow, transient aquatic system, they do what is called a flip, ecological flip. Either they become deep water bodies, then it's a problem, or they completely flip into terrestrial. The biggest invasive species of India, Prosopis, thorny bush, plays havoc when it comes to wetland. It takes just a year or two for a wetland to totally disappear and overrun by Prosopis. After that, God help us, there's nothing we can do about this. And then, of course, we don't have a monitoring system, especially where there is a participatory monitoring system. The communities with whom we are working, they also need to be part of the monitoring system that we don't have. Next slide. This is something that I'm saying with a lot of pain. The video made a beautiful reference to the glorious cultural association that we have. I had the opportunity of authoring the report, which was submitted by Government of India to the Ramsar Convention. My team traveled the length and breadth of the country. It was an all-woman team that actually wrote it. You know, the kind of association, the kind of, what should I say, bond that we had as a country, as a culture with wetlands, the kind of bond that was forged out of an understanding of what aquatic systems are, the kind of importance that we assign to it, the kind of deities we may nominate to the place. Where has it all gone? We may say that it exists, but it's forgotten history. Even in those places where these wetlands exist today, not many people knew about it. Traditions associated were completely lost. Relationship was severe, and most of them were being treated as no man's land. There were exceptions, of course, like the one you had in Mandi, Parashar, places in Kotak, Bhubaneswar, Sundarbans. The bigger entities, the well-known entities, they're all there. But there are a whole lot of other entities that are disappeared. In fact, very close to Chennai, there is this wonderful place called Madurantakam, where the history, it's a bit of a myth, but it's beautiful. It says that the British officer who was there, saw a vision of Lord Ram protecting the wetland. Even people in those villages didn't know about it. So the connect is gone. When the connect is gone, neighborhoods don't care what happens to their wetland. And this is something typical of all the urban wetlands that you see. Communities living on the banks of the wetland have no connect with the wetland. So this kind of lost association, the kind of ignorance that typifies it, is what is causing a big problem when it comes to creating a constituency for the wetland. You need the local community championing it. Wherever they are doing it, it's working well. I myself have been happily associated with two of them, both from Chennai, where the local community in a place called Chittapakam took up the responsibility of protecting their wetland, and they've done a phenomenal job. They've been able to mobilize funds, they've been able to mobilize experts. Likewise, one community in Vengatur in Tiruvallur, that's close to Chennai. The entire initiative was led by them, and they're sustaining it. It's not just a question of 1 day, 2 days. They've been able to bring in experts, bring in agencies which would restore. And for a little over 5-6 years, they're still at it, and it's now become a self-sufficient system. So those are the things that I wish to highlight when it comes to cultural land. Next slide. So after painting such a dismal picture of what we are doing and what we are not doing right, can we still dream of a wise guided wetland conservation of India? I can say this with absolute confidence, yes. Not because I watched the Jal Shakti mission thing. That actually gives me an additional kind of a strength that's desperately needed. We have the commitment, we have the capacity, we have the capability, we have the funding, we have everything that needs to be done to foster a wise use-based wetland conservation for India. The small gaps that exist can be plugged Because one advantage that the country has, India has, is the availability of expertise. That's something that we are not short of. A whole lot of experts. And these experts are not limited only to research institutes. They are there everywhere. They are in the government, very senior officials, and years working on the issue in the civil society. So that advantage is something that we need to capitalize on. The next slide, please. What are the small tweaks? The small tweaks that I spoke about, what are they? First, of course, we have to reiterate, emphasize, drive it home hard that the natural defense and buffer system for climate change, especially against floods and droughts, comes only from wetlands. These are our nature's vardhan for handling climate change. For all the mess that we heaped on the planet, we still have a hope in wetlands. These are the only option for water security. And water is essential for everything. For the civilization to be there, we need water. So fresh water we know is very, very limited. In fact, my own association with wetlands was influenced by a statement that I heard in a meeting many years ago, when then President of the World Bank, Mr. Ismail Seragaldi, spoke about how if there were to be another war, it would be based on water. I was a young scholar taking down notes in that assignment. That struck such a chord in me that I decided I'll work on wetlands. Essentially, we are talking about water security. We have to be secure. We have to progress the way we ought to. Wetlands are absolutely a must. That needs to be driven home. It's not a question of protecting only lakes, ponds, and camps. It's a question of protecting every system that has the ability to hold water, to discharge water, to percolate water. And that's why it needs to be treated as infrastructure. We should no longer look at infrastructure as being limited only to buildings and roads and railway networks. Infrastructure needs to include social infrastructure, also natural infrastructure. One of the key elements that we need to look into wetlands. We recently completed an assignment on climate risk and communities, which told us all this. Further reiterated by the green printing report that we did with IIT Madras and the Nature Conservancy, essentially looking at how would the city be if wetlands are protected. Extreme case if all the wetlands were usurped and converted into land. This kind of a modeling we did, and we were able to very clearly show that if Chennai, I can limit myself only to Chennai on this. If Chennai has to sustain, it needs to protect wetlands. The next, it's also time that we looked into wetlands as multifunctional habitat. We all know that we really don't have the kind of land the country wishes to have. Every bit of land needs to be put to multifunctional. The same goes for wetland. We can no longer dedicate huge areas and reservoirs. That option is gone. The reservoir should have additional features. We should have restoration goals that are very realistic and time bound. You cannot be forever claiming that you're cleaning up a river, 5 regimes, 6 regimes, and you're still cleaning up the river. That shouldn't be there. Innovation has to be there. And violations to aquatic systems need to be treated very, very severely. Because this is a crime not just against that particular generation, against also the future. So that needs to be taken into consideration. And science, of course, should be the basis for it. Emotion comes in much later. Next slide. And this is something that I'm hoping would be taken seriously. I think we should move into a regime of progressive restoration. This is especially because we have this debate of whether we practice conservation or whether we should go for development. I for one don't believe there is anything of a dichotomy there. Your development has to include conservation of natural resources. These two are the same actually, two sides of a coin. In the event you have to sanction or implement huge problems which will have an impact on natural systems. See, every initiative that we take up, this is common sense, this is not science, will have a bearing on natural resources. That doesn't mean you shut doors to everything. But you can come up with what is called the progressive restoration approach, wherein your restoration begins from the day you plan the project. It's not a kind of an aftermath that we're looking at. You don't complete a project and then get into a restoration. Your restoration begins at the time you plan the project. So it's a very safe kind of an approach. And this is something that we need to do, and it should be based on a reference model. These are steps that are outlined very clearly. Your reservation should be a kind of a simulation of what existed there. That is what is called a reference model. If this is made a compliance feature of all mega projects, I think wetlands stand a very good chance of thriving, continuing, in fact, improving far more than what they are. And that I think would be my last slide. Oh no, I have the most important one. We need to invest a lot in building up a constituency. And who are these constituents that I'm talking about? I'm essentially referring to young adults, children, the young adults. They need to be oriented to wetland conservation by including technical matter. It's not enough if you just talk Dhyan, give them this awareness without any substance to it. It should be made part of their curriculum. You should make sure that you involve celebrities, people with good hearts into it, because they have the ability to strike a chord. The following books that you see, the Home of the Blue Lily, Be My Happy Place, and the titles themselves are rather interesting, not normal titles that you find in books. These are the things that attract the attention of children and schools and people. So, holding of exhibitions. The point I'm trying to make is when you do all this, they may seem as being of no impact. Very often I get asked, why do you do this? Why can't you stick to doing science? This is also science, and this needs to be done with the same amount of commitment. Once you are able to do that, you build a lot of support for your work. When we began our work way back in 2000 on wetlands, we did not have much support. But today, every person that we meet to has something to say as an input. They either tell us that we are doing good or they tell us to correct ourselves. But there is an interaction, and this is what I mean by building a constituency. I think we need to invest in that. That would be my last slide. Yes, I'm very sure. Thank you. This is an extract from the next book that we are doing on aquatic plants. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. There was a lot that we did not know about wetland protection and conservation, and very basic about wetlands too. Thank you for bringing all of this to light, and thank you for telling us the next steps that are ahead of us. And we as a community need to take a proactive approach to wetland conservation, be it youth, be it the adults, or be it the community as a whole. Thank you for highlighting the challenges as well as the solutions too. And
Thank you.
we have been joined by our special guest. I would like to welcome Archana Verma, ma'am, Mission Director of National Water Mission, Ministry of Jal Shakti. Welcome, ma'am. Thank you for being here with us today. Uh, we would also want to know from Archana, ma'am, her insights on wetland conservation and the importance of grassroots action in water conservation and resource management. Ma'am, if you want to share anything with us, you're on mute.
Good afternoon, Dr. Jayshree Vencatesan. First of all, I would like to apologize that I joined the meeting late. I'm a little unwell today. And I saw through the presentation, and really, you came out as a very, very remarkable person who has, not only won the Ramsar Award for wise use of wetlands, but also single-handedly been able to, build a whole community and raise awareness about wetlands and also work for its protection, especially in Chennai. So, first of all, we extend our gratitude to you for all the great work that you have done, especially in Chennai. And the best thing is that not only have you worked, you have very scientifically documented all the works. And when you talk about evidence-based, interventions, evidence-based policy, that is something which is very, very important. That we need our policies have to be backed by evidence and voices, especially of the community from the field. Having said that, let me just outline a little about the wetland policy in India. Wetland conservation is not under the Ministry of Jal Shakti. Despite it being a marshy water body, it is under and it's a water body, it is under the Ministry of Environment and Forest. So basically, policies on wetland are determined by the Environment of Forest, uh, and we are guided by the Ramsar Convention. We, at the national level, as you must be already aware, but I'm just talking for the knowledge of the viewers, we have the Wetland Conservation and Management Policy Regulation, which is basically a framework of regulation which mandates there's a national wetland committee under the Ministry of Forest. Then we have the state wetland authorities, and water being a decentralized subject uh, under the overall guidance of the national wetland policy, a national wetland committee. It's basically the state wetland authorities which are supposed to set the framework and provide guidance and all the issues that you have highlighted with regard to the problems in because I was in Assam, and Assam has a lot of wetlands, and the Por Beal is one of the Ramsar convention site. But there are many problems which wetlands faces. First is, even though we need community participation, the first opposition comes from the community because of the encroachment that happens on the wetlands. Because they're shallow marshy lands, it's basically easy to encroach. So there are issues of encroachment. There's an issue of you know certain types of weeds also growing in the wetland, which may be harmful for the ecology and for the flora and fauna of the wetland. So the cost of doing all that. So I completely agree with you that, we have state specific efforts. Like I think Jammu Kashmir, Punjab, these are some of the states which have done, Jammu Kashmir and Punjab have come out with health cards for wetlands. They have, looked at their wetlands, and they have done ground truthing and come out with health cards. So that I think is a very good idea to rate your wetlands. That what is the health of your wetlands? So this health card scheme, health card initiative for done by especially Punjab and Jammu Kashmir, I think is very well. Then, just like in Jal Shakti Abhiyan, when we started, we have been insisting on a integrated district water conservation plan for rainwater harvesting. So similarly, while some of the states have come up with integrated wetland management plan, we do need a integrated wetland management plan, and we also need stricter regulation, like perhaps civil penalties for you know for violating the norms of wetland. And as you very rightly pointed out, we need a clearer definition of what is a wetland. But of course, there are wetlands in high altitudes, there are wetlands in floodplains. We cannot have one size fit all definition. But we need to have a clearer definition of wetland. On that, I would agree. We need to have more intersectoral coordination among the ministries, among the states on wetland. Right now, wetland is seen more as a Ministry of Environment thing and less as a Ministry of Jal Shakti thing. Though there, under the Jal Shakti Abhiyan and Catch the Rain, we are also trying to integrate wetland protection as one of the areas for the DMs, for the municipal commissioners to take it up in the integrated district water conservation plan. But of course, wetlands are very different from other water ecosystems, so they need more technical guidance. It's not that anybody can restore a wetland. I remember an interesting story of I was in the Ministry of Urban Affairs, and we were responsible for the State Wetland Authority implementation in Assam. So in one of the sites where there was a railway track passing through the wetland. So the NGT or some other, I think it was the NGT, was very clear that this cannot be encroached because this is a site which is for a wetland, and also the site where elephants pass through that site. So it became very difficult for us to sometimes for administrators to balance between growth and or economy and ecology. So that is one of the problems which administrators also face, because many of the wetlands are in areas where already some kind of development has taken place. So for an NGO, for an activist, it would be easier to say कि हटाओ, and it's always nature versus development. But for administrators, we have to look at it holistically. We also have to somewhere get a balance and strike a balance between conservation and development. But as you said, that it needn't be this versus that, development versus ecology, and we can always find a path. And generally as administrators, we try to balance that we need conservation, but at the same time we need displacement of human beings. If needed, it has to be done in the most humane manner, and sometimes it becomes very difficult. But funding for wetlands, though there are schemes, there is the National Aquatic scheme, I think, by Ministry of Environment and Forest. There are some central schemes for wetlands. I think they are not enough. But gradually, I also feel that, especially with the Ramsar sites being, India being one of the leaders in having as many Ramsar sites, and the National Wetland Portal, if you visit, if anybody visits, it has a lot of information on what is happening in wetlands across the state. So we are gradually, I think, consciousness, especially when people see that the problems of having lost the water bodies in urban areas, when people are actually facing not only the heat, they're facing scarcity of groundwater, they're facing lots of problems of mosquitoes and all, because you don't have water bodies which absorb so many of the bugs that bite us. So I guess slowly and gradually a wetland consciousness is emerging. But of course, I completely agree with you that it needs a more accelerated approach, and it needs more interaction both at the state and the central level. And it should also not be considered, wetland should not be considered as an ecosystem which is independent of the human beings or independent of other aspects of uh, we have been able, under the Jal Shakti Abhiyan, been able to integrate to a great extent the water as an entity along with people, that water being for people, but somehow rivers for people, ponds and lakes for people. And we have seen a lot of public participation in restoring of water bodies by the people. But for wetlands, perhaps because of its because of the statutory framework and because of its fragility, it has become an a very standalone ecosystem. So people who claim, so it's somehow somewhere looked at it in isolation of the people and the habitation and where they actually are situated. So we need a lot of community involvement in wetland conservation, and we also need the people who are conserving the wetland to understand that, that it is finally the community which has to take ownership. It is finally the people who have to conserve the wetland. So somewhere, it cannot be that no, wetlands are ekdam sacred and they cannot be touched and nothing can be done. So that kind of approach generally I've seen doesn't work for a sustainable approach. So while we need regulation, while we need penalization, we also need a more favorable balance between the community and the saviors of wetland to come together to do, and the state agencies to do something which is practical and which is a win-win for everybody. So these are my first thoughts, Ananya. Over to you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was very interesting to understand the civil society organization perspective as well the administrative perspective, the challenges and the opportunities that are there from two different perspectives for a common goal that we have in front of us. Uh, we can take up some questions. We have some questions from the audience if the time is permitting, ma'am. Can we? Uh, Sorry, ma'am, you're on mute. Cannot hear you.
Two, three questions because I have to prepare for a meeting with Honorable
Sure.
Minister.
Yes, we'll take a couple
So,
only. Okay. The first question is
and
from
I would want
Jesh.
it to be addressed more to Jayshree ma'am because then we can learn so much.
Yes.
I can.
Okay.
Okay, so take
Sure.
the
I'm sorry.
questions which are addressed to her.
Sure. Sure, ma'am. Okay. First question is for Jayshree, ma'am. Ma'am, the question is that if you can please elaborate on how wetlands replenish groundwater and how do they purify water. If you could elaborate on the process in these two services.
That's going to be a very long answer. Maybe you can request the person to get in touch with me independently.
Okay.
Because
If you could
it's
just, yeah, if you
no,
can
essentially
briefly,
wetlands, yeah, wetlands, I will give you the basics. Wetlands have a soil profile that is very spongy. The word has to be, a single word has to be used to describe it. It's like a sponge. So just as a sponge would function, this wetland also functions. If you pour water on the sponge, it takes time for it to take it in. I mean, it doesn't immediately absorb. It retains it for at the surface for some time, then slowly draws it in and keeps it in there. But it doesn't keep it in forever. There will also be a discharge on it. That is exactly how it is done. When the water falls on a wetland, it's visible only for some time. After that, it goes into the soil, stays there, and slowly drains it, recharges the ground. The second part of the question is how does it actually help in pollution abatement? The same process. You would see this in an aquarium. All of us keep aquariums. Most of us keep aquariums at home, where you have beds of different kind of stuff. You have a charcoal bed, you have a pebble bed, you have a sand bed. As the water passes through each of these beds, impurities are removed. Wetland functions exactly the same. This would be the most common word phrasing of the process. A technical process, of course, it's available. It's essentially a bed of stuff that handles water.
got it. Okay. Thank you. The second question is also for you. How can urban development and infrastructure projects be balanced with wetland conservation in rapidly growing cities? So, how can a balance be maintained?
By treating wetlands also as infrastructure. That would be my single line answer. What is happening now is you treat it as something that can be handled in a manner that's not to be handled. You think it's perfectly okay for it to be converted to other land forms, other land use. That should not be the approach. You factor in the presence of a wetland into your design for the city, into the plan for your city. You take it for granted that this place has to be locked up as a water entity forever. then do the plan. Then conservation will be taken care of. And your urban planning also will not suffer. Only when you approach that area of being available for conversion to other land uses, we have a problem. You treat it as an entity of water and not to be converted. It's fine. The second thing is certain areas which are waterlogged, they're naturally inclined to be waterlogged or flood prone, or areas which have a kind of a issue discharging water. You let it go as a no development zone. Don't try to mess around with it because, as I said, these systems take hundreds of years to evolve and stabilize. You cannot mess around with it and then expect no retaliation. So, I'm trying to sound a bit like what should I say, a policeman, but bear with me on that. This is the best way I could describe it. The retaliation will happen. The retaliation is by way of flooding or waterlogging. Certain areas, if there are no go, don't go there. Don't recontour the place. Don't try to come up with alternate retrofitting things. Don't do that. Stay away from it. Things will be fine.
Got it. Archana ma'am, there's one question for you as well. Um the question
Yes.
is, what policy interventions or community-driven initiatives do you believe are most crucial for ensuring the long-term protection and restoration of India's wetlands? So, from a community perspective, what kind of interventions do you believe should be in place?
I sincerely feel that right from project design to its implementation to its operation and maintenance, community should be involved, especially women. People from that local area should be involved not only when the project gets implemented, but right from in the project design there should be some provision. There should be provision for community involvement. There should also be provision for technical help to the community, and raising awareness, and community should be made part of the spreading of awareness to the people about why that wetland is important in that area. So I think without community, just to stand alone, administrative work on the wetland generally again leads to, because the community doesn't have respect, then again it leads to, it's like the chipko movement. Remember, it was only when people started hugging trees and they started owning the trees that tree cutting stopped. So it's something like that, that should be people should chipko to their wetlands, and they should stop others from desecrating it once it's made. So right from project design to the end of the project to its maintenance, community should lead the initiative in water, in wetland conservation.
Right. We will take just one more question for Jayshree ma'am again. Ma'am, the question is, what is the role of local communities and indigenous knowledge in the conservation of wetlands?
Absolutely critical. When it comes to indigenous knowledge, the kind of repository that the country has is breathtaking and unbelievable. But I should also say that documenting indigenous knowledge is not as easy as we assume it to be. Very often, what we end up documenting as indigenous knowledge would be things that everybody knows, and it's not something specialized. You need a specialization. You need specialists to document indigenous knowledge, but it is very critical. I will just share one small example. Take just a minute. This is in the district of Ramanathapuram, where we were assigned, Care Earth was assigned to do the wetland action plan for two bird sanctuaries, which are adjacent to each other, just 100 meters apart or 50 meters apart. And both get treated as a single entity. And we had gone there for assessing the wetland and found that there was not even a drop there and there were no birds there. And the frontline staff of the department who were accompanying us told us it's because of climate change that there is no water. But we looked around all other wetlands which is in that place. The Ramanathapuram is full of wetlands, had water, and we were wondering what was happening. A group of senior women, you wouldn't believe this, all of them above 70 plus, they told us the fundamental mistake is in the manner in which these wetlands are being treated. We said, how so? They said they belong to two different cascades, but the department treats it as a single cascade. Then we took that as an input, although we had no belief in what they were saying at that point of time. Ran an assessment, looked through literature, looked through maps, and we found that the women were right. Except that since it was not documented anywhere, it was folklore. I mean, we like to call it folklore, but I think it's knowledge. Women knew what was happening and what was not happening, but there was no way by which the others could know. Then we went on to document the whole thing in the cascading system and found that that place was uniquely organized, and there was a dugout canal which was made in 1700s by a small king then, and that was the feeder canal for these two wetlands, and these two are completely different, although they were just 100 meters apart. So this became a big lesson in learning for us. So that's the kind of knowledge you're looking at. I mean, the point I'm trying to make is that's the precision and that's the depth of knowledge that you have in indigenous knowledge. That needs to be brought into planning. As ma'am was saying, every aspect of it we have to consult, we have to include. There's no point in putting that as an addendum in your report, that there are these women who say this. Put their pictures on the cover. That's what we do end up doing. I'm talking about civil society. We should celebrate, but more importantly, give them the recognition and take the knowledge and include it in your plan. Only when it becomes critical as an input in your scheme of things does all this happen. Otherwise, it's just mockery, I feel.
True. Thank you, ma'am, for those insights and those answers. Archana, ma'am, parting word from you. Any other insights that you would want to share with us? Ma'am, mute.
I would like to thank Jayshree ma'am again for the very insightful discussion and for the good questions also. And I have to really rush. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you, Dr. Jayshree, ma'am,
Thank
for
you,
being
ma'am.
with us here today. And
Thank
thank you
you.
to our wonderful audience for the questions. And we will be back again with the next edition of Water Talk. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone,
Thank
for
you so
being
much.
here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
ma'am.